Okay, welcome to the next lecture of ES 300, Energy and the Environment. Today we're going to talk about supply, demand, and market prices. So last time we focused on firm production decisions. So if you recall, a couple lectures ago, we talked about basic accounting, project finance. In other words, how would a utility get the money to build a power plant or another piece of expensive infrastructure? And then we spent some time on talking about net present value and project valuation. So if a utility could get the money to build a power plant, how does it actually decide if it's a good decision? And we noted in that discussion that net present value involves projecting out into the future what profits are going to be. And last time we talked about firm production decisions, which is essentially was a way of studying through a microeconomic lens, the way that utilities make decisions about how they operate a plant once it's been built, and that those decisions are deeply involved in determining what profits are out into the future. And we talked about a rule of thumb for optimizing the decisions about how much of a product a firm should sell, where we came up with a rule of thumb of producing at a level where the marginal cost equals the price as a way to maximize profits. So essentially, this was a way of getting at how utilities in general or other firms should operate a plant once they've decided to build it. So today we're going to talk about prices. I ended up with the last lecture talking about needing to know what the price is in order to determine what the optimal level of production is. So we're going to talk today about how prices are determined in competitive markets. We'll spend some time thinking about how we quantify how prices change as a function of fluctuations in supply and demand. And we'll also talk about how we quantify how demand for goods change with price. Okay, so we're going to talk about supply and demand today. So when we think about supply, we're not really talking about individual suppliers. We're talking about suppliers in aggregate. So, for example, all the people that make and sell things. For example, all textbook producers in the United States. And when we talk about demand, we're talking about all the people who might want to buy those textbooks. So not just an individual college student who might need to buy a textbook. So again, we're not talking about individual producers and consumers, but rather large collections of each. So two laws here, the law of supply and the law of demand. The law of supply states that if the price goes up, if the market price goes up, the quantity of goods supplied by the market will also increase. In other words, producers will take advantage of an opportunity to make more money. So let's look at a pretend supply curve here. So we have four different data points in this pretend supply curve, four different prices listed in dollars per unit, and also four different quantities supplied by the market. So at $50 per unit, the market will supply 1,000. At $70 per unit, the market will supply 2,500. At $100 per unit, the market will supply 3,500. And at $125 per unit, the market will supply 4,000. So we have four ordered pairs here, an X value and a Y value, so we can plot this. So this is that same data, just plotted where on the Y-axis we have the price, and on the X-axis the quantity supplied. And remember, this is aggregated across all suppliers, not for an individual supplier. So what impacts the position of this supply curve? There are a couple different things that matter here. Number one could be the cost of raw materials. Let's say that some specific raw material goes into the process of making whatever it is we're producing, and the price of those raw materials increases. What that means is that our money doesn't go quite as far. In other words, we get decreased supply for the same amount of money across the board. And what that has the effect of doing is that for every given price, the market is now supplying less. Other things that could impact the position of the supply curve would be the number of suppliers, as well as technological innovation. So technological innovation might do the opposite as an increase in the cost of raw materials. If there's some sort of innovation that increases the efficiency of this production process in this market, we might be able to get increased supply for the exact same amount of money. And so as a result, the system supply curve would shift outward to the right. So at every price, we're able to get more quantity supplied. So that's the law of supply. Let's talk about the law of demand. So the law of demand states that if the price goes up, the quantity of goods demanded by consumers will decrease. So let's look at a pretend demand curve. Again, 4 data points here, 4 ordered pairs. The same prices, $50 per unit, $70 per unit, $100 per unit, and $125 per unit. And in this case, the quantity demanded decreases as a function of this increase in price. So at $50 per unit, the quantity demanded is 4,000. At $70 per unit, the quantity demanded is 2,500. At $100 per unit, the quantity demanded is 1,500. And then at the most expensive price, $125 per unit, the quantity demanded is 1,000. So we can also visualize this in 2D space by plotting price on the y-axis and quantity demanded on the x-axis. And note that there's a negative slope here. The supply curve was sloped the other direction, and demand has a negative relationship between price and quantity demanded. So what can impact the position of the demand curve? A couple different things. For example, the price of substitute products. So if we produce something and there's another product out there in the market that consumers could buy in place of that, and basically replace the functionality or the utility of whatever it is that we produce, and for some reason there's an increase in that price, then of that substitute product, then it's likely that demand for our product that we produce will increase. Likewise, if there's a decrease in the substitute product price, consumers will demand less of what we make. So we can visualize that here. So if there's the price of a substitute decreases, that means that demand for our product may decrease. And the way we show that is an inward or leftward shift of the demand curve. And what that means is that for any given price, the quantity demanded is lower. So other things that could impact the position of the demand curve: income among consumers, as well as preferences. So we are here to talk about prices. How are market prices determined? They're determined through what we would call market equilibrium. That just refers to the point where the supply and demand curves intersect. And what we see here is that intersection occurs at about a price of $70 per unit. So the point where the yellow supply curve and the pink demand curve meet, the value on the y-axis associated with that intersection is our market price. So in theory, prices are set by the intersection of the supply and the demand curve. So let's look at a couple different sort of funny situations. Let's say that we have this existing supply curve and the demand curve, and market equilibrium suggests that the price would be on the order of $70 per unit. However, we have suppliers that are producing 3,500 units. So the market equilibrium would suggest that given our demand curve and our supply curve, producers should produce about 2,500 units and sell them for about $70 per unit. So what if suppliers are producing more than that 2,500? In fact, they're producing 3,500. What do we call this? So this situation is called a market surplus, and that's when the quantity of goods that are supplied by the producers is greater than the quantity of goods that's demanded at that current market price. And so when this happens, what it indicates is that suppliers will not be able to sell all their goods. And what should they do? They should sell less and decrease their asking price. And so that's what this shows, is that the suppliers should, in theory, move along and downward along the system supply curve, decreasing the amount that they produce and decreasing their asking price in order to sort of realign with the demand curve and to come back into equilibrium. So this is another sort of funny case. Again, we have the same system supply and system demand curves indicating that market equilibrium occurs at a price of $70 per unit when suppliers are producing about 2,500 units. In this case, let's pretend that the suppliers are producing way less than the 2,500 units. They're only producing 1,000 units and hoping to sell them at a price of about $50 per unit. So what's this called? That would be called a shortage. So this is where the market or suppliers in general are providing a quantity of goods that's less than the quantity of goods that would be demanded at the current price. So in this case, consumers cannot satisfy their demand for goods. So what should suppliers do? They should sell more and they should increase their asking prices. So they would move along the system supply curve, increasing quantity supplied, and their asking prices in order to come back into equilibrium with the demand. In other words, they should increase production until they reach 2,500 units and an asking price of $70 per unit. So this is what we refer to as competitive markets being somewhat self-regulated or guided by an invisible hand. And this is the phrase that was coined by Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations. So let's talk also about time frame, because in our discussion of system supply curves and demand curves shifting, it's really important to understand over what time frames that can actually happen. In the long term, shifts can happen. So let's say we have these two same system supply and demand curves. They're in equilibrium at a price of about $70 per unit, where the suppliers are producing or supplying about 2,500 units. So we could see, for example, an inward shift in the demand curve if there's a decrease in the price of some sort of substitute product that decreases demand for the product that our market produces. The entire demand curve could shift inward to the left. And then what that means is that this new demand curve, which would be shown in blue here, intersects our system supply curve in yellow at a different point. And that different point happens to be at a lower point along the y-axis. And so as a result, our market clearing price goes down. So that second green dotted line below our first one represents the reduction in the market price that would be associated with an inward shift or lower demand. And so if you want to sort of break this down in really simple terms, you could say that lower demand or an inward shift in the demand curve leads to lower prices, and higher demand or a rightward outward shift in demand leads to higher prices. So let's look at another example where we're back to these two system supply and demand curves in equilibrium at about $70 per unit. The market is providing at that price about 2,500 units. So we could also see an outward shift in supply, for example, as a result of some sort of technological innovation that makes the production process more efficient, so we get more supply for the same amount of money. And so what this shows is a new system supply curve in blue. And this new system supply curve intersects the demand curve at a different point. And this point happens to be, again, lower than the previous intersection. So at a lower point on the y-axis. And that means that we, again, see a reduction in the market clearing price. So the second green dotted line that's associated with our new intersection is lower than the first intersection, the first green dotted line. And so that vertical difference represents the reduction in the market clearing price that's associated with this, in this case, with an outward shift in the supply curve. So another rule of thumb, we could say that lower supply or an inward shift in the supply curve leads to higher prices, and greater supply or an outward shift in the supply curve leads to lower prices. So that can happen in the long term, but in the short term, prices can be more volatile because of either inelastic or inflexible demand or supply. So let's look a little bit more at this.